Now, let's focus on Kenya. The Kenyan President, William Ruto, has spent the better part of this afternoon defending his administration's economic record in his State of the Nation address in Parliament. He says inflation has declined from 9.6% in September 2022 to 2.7% in October 2024. That's essentially the lowest print we've had in about 17 years. He says the country's foreign exchange reserves surged by $2.4 billion to hit a record $9.5 billion, providing 4.8 months of import cover, and that's the highest, he says, in about a decade. In his speech, the president announced the cancellation of two major contracts with India's Adani Group, which included a controversial airport deal that triggered some protests by workers back in September. Let's bring in Ken Gishinga for some analysis of that State of the Nation address. Is the CEO at Mentoria Economics. Thanks for your time this evening, Ken. So let's start with the president's move to direct the ministries of energy and transport to cancel any contracts with Adani. Now, for large-scale projects or contracts of this sort, termination clauses tend to be fairly common in these deals. So how much could the Kenyan taxpayer be potentially on the hook for?
Many thanks, Rama. Indeed, these large-scale projects do have clauses where projects have to be compensated. I think for historical precedents, one has to go back 8 years ago at the Jomo Kenyatta Airport, where the Greenfield Terminal project was cancelled. And for that, the government had to pay about $70 million to the Chinese contractors. Now, this time around, it could be different. The government has insisted they have never signed an agreement, particularly on the JKIA. But I think on the Ketraco one, that had already been signed. And I think there could be a bit more liabilities there.
Indeed. And part of the problem here is that we don't know the exact amount of money that would be on the hook for, because those documents, the contracts in question, like the one with Ketraco, which is signed on the 11th of October, that's not been made public yet. And Ketraco and the state have been fighting any effort to make that a public document.
You're absolutely right. In fact, even the tariffs that had been proposed, they refused to disclose that to the public. And this is something Adani not only has done here in Kenya, but also in India. That has been their approach. So it's a bit of a relief, I guess, for the Kenyan public. But you're right, there could be a bit of liabilities for the government.
Right. I want to move on to a counter argument that we've heard a lot from the state and government proxies when they say, look, we need these PPPs like the $1.85 billion one involving the airport because domestic debt markets simply cannot raise this kind of money. But I then look at the data from T-bill auctions. This week, for example, actually held today. Total bids nearly $600 million. Last week, total bids were over $700 million. So clearly there's liquidity in the market. The problem here is not a lack of cash. So what is it then?
Well, the problem, Rama, is that liquidity is only coming in because of high interest rates. And that's what the problem the government is trying to cure. They really argue that we need to get back to lower interest rates, which might attract less capital. So I think the crowding out effect you're seeing in the private sector is really because money is chasing those high yields, but it's not sustainable for the economy as it is.
But the argument could also be made that there's a lack of transparency here, right, around exactly what the benefit would be if you want to park your money in for 10, 20, 15 years, for example, because it's not that people don't want to put money into energy. We know that energy demand is going to be there. It's not that we don't want to put money into infrastructure investments in the airports. Jomo Kenyatta International certainly needs a new runway and a better terminal, but at the end of the day, the question is, where's the return? What's the investment structure like? Who's going to manage the funds? That lack of clarity and structure is a big impediment as well, isn't it?
It is, and obviously it makes the risk go up, especially when there have been historical precedents of contracts being cancelled. So obviously that makes the risk profile that much higher. But if you look at government securities, infrastructure bonds, they're almost considered risk-free. So when they are going at 16, 17, 18%, definitely they will attract as much funding as there is out there.
Indeed. One last question for you. So the president also said something interesting in his speech today. Interest rates, he says, are trending downwards. And that's those three words essentially are quoted straight out of his speech. But that's not really the case for private sector credit, is it? Because NPLs are still pretty elevated. Most banks are yet to revise their lending rates downwards in order to pass on the benefits of the rate cut we've seen from the central bank.
Yeah, the monetary policy transmission signal appears to be broken. The CBK has almost twice reduce interest rates, but only two banks have reduced interest rates to their customers. And even in those two situations, they have not reduced by the same margin that the CBK reduced. So it's a broken monetary policy transmission. And you're right, NPLs are at the highest level in 18 years. So households are struggling, businesses are struggling. And I think the CBK was supposed to have a meeting with commercial banks to do a brainstorming session. But what we really need is to see banks passing on those interest rate cuts to their clients.
Indeed.